Alright, what's going on YouTube? We are back here with another episode in the beginner series for learning Unreal Engine, and in this episode we will be going over the details and basics of blueprints. So let's get right into it by going to our blueprint folder that we created in the last episode and opening our new blueprint. Now what we're going to go over is how you code with blueprints and what you see when you start off. So last time we talked about the viewport, we manipulated an object, we added an object, we talked about components over here, and we talked about variables a little bit, I believe, and we added a texture, or material, excuse me, to this object. But now let's talk about actual coding. So there's a lot of terminologies that you'll need to know for coding, and what we use and what keywords and terminologies we use when talking about blueprint coding. You're gonna have about 10 or 20 main things that you will talk about a lot. That's a rough number. It's not exact. I didn't really think about it, but it's about 10 or maybe even 15. But what you have is you have your event graph. That's where all of your coding actually happens. And then you have your variables. That's what you'll be using in your coding a lot. You'll be using variables quite often. Then you'll be using your details tab every now and then, whether it's for components or whether it's for class defaults, class settings, or the like, or even, for an example, a custom class or custom event. You'll be using the components for custom event nodes. Now, what we need to talk about first is these two of these main nodes that we have here. So these little boxes are called nodes, and you can select them. Now these one are faded because they are the suggested nodes, if you will, to start your program or your coding, your blueprint. But you don't have to use them. If you know you don't need them, you can just select them, right click, and delete. But the only one that we're not going to use is this event after begin overlap. So we're just going to delete this one. So what we want to do is we want to drag off the execution line. Now what the execution line is it's this little white arrow that you can drag off from. As you can see, if you hover over it, it says EXEC. That stands for execution. So this is our execution line, and you'll see it says place a new node. So we're just going to drag off. We're going to place a new node, and we're going to do a print. Now, print string is how you print something as just a debug. It's commonly used for debugging if you're trying to figure out if a code is running, if it's not running. You just want, or maybe you just want an output and you just want to get some words on the screen for a certain event happening. Print string is very common to use in debugging, but you'll never really want to use print string. That's not what you're going to want to use in your polished, finished project. So what we want to just say is, I don't know, I could have left hello there. Hello, YouTube, if I could spell. Once again, I say that about every episode. Hello, YouTube. And you have a couple settings here. You can change the text color if you want. You can change the duration for how long it lasts, and this is in seconds, I believe. Then you can also print it to the log if you want, and print it to the screen if you want. Now, maybe you don't want it on screen, but you want it in the log. That's where you would still keep this in your code, but you would want this in the log, so you would disable this. But if you want it on the screen, but not in the log, vice versa, but if you want them on both, you can just keep them both checked. Now, what's going to happen if we compile here? Compiling is how you get your code, how do I put this? Let's see its description. Well, that's not a good description. Thanks. Control Alt. Okay, let's just read this off. This will compile the blueprint for any errors or warnings, and they'll be flagged. So it just checks, it kind of corrects your code, it looks through everything, makes sure everything's okay and that there's no errors, and it makes sure that everything will run properly. Now, it won't necessarily function the way you want it to function, but it won't cause an error for the engine to crash or the game to crash. That's all compiling does. But it won't necessarily run the function or make the game do what you want it to do because maybe it wasn't coded properly, but that's just something you can work out later in your development cycle. So what you can do now is you can press play, and it'll actually pop up a window that will allow us to play. Now, there are some background noises which I don't actually want, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into our world, then our viewport, and you can see the speaker here. This is just some background noise. I'm actually just going to delete this because I don't want any of the noise. What I'm going to do is, in order for this code to run, we need this object to be in our world because it's on begin play. So begin play, but only if it's in our world. So let's drag this into our world. So we'll have the cube in our world. Let's press play. And as you can see, in red, it says hello YouTube, and it only lasts for 2 seconds. But say you want that message to stay... That doesn't look weird at all. Oh, that's what it is. It's the arrow. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But say you want that message to stay up there all the time, and you want it to duplicate. Well, that's what our event tick is for. This event tick runs it every, I believe, 1 millisecond, or a delta second, which a delta second is, I believe, a tenth of a second or a millisecond. So if we compile this and play, not only will it run it at the beginning, but it will run it continuously forever and ever and ever. And that's all because this object is in our world. Now, if we take this object and take it out of our world, you can see none of that will happen. So, if you want code to run, make sure the object is in your world. So, what else do we need to understand for blueprint coding? Okay, I've got it. I can add things to the begin play because I only want them to run once, but I can add things to the event tick because I want them to run all the time. I think I'm good. No, not quite. There's a couple more steps that we need to cover of what coding involves and entails than just our event begin and our event begin play and our event tick and our execution lines and our print string and whatnot. Sure, you could right click and just say you want to transform something to make it move, because we learned this in math class, right kids? So I want to transform something. Okay, let's see, which one looks right? Which one? This one looks right. Add world transformation. But then you don't know what it's going to. So we know it's going to the cube, but then we have to work delta transform and all these variables, and we don't know what to do. But maybe I just use a vocabulary word for you that you don't know what it means, and that would be the word variable. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain variables real quick. So variables are a piece of data that holds some information. So it can be, but variables are broken up into different types of categories. Your basic variables that you have in pretty much every code are like bools, floats, integers, names, strings, and things of that sort. But you have other things also in Unreal Engine that are Unreal Engine specific, like structures, blueprints, actors, objects. Actually, object is a default C++ class, and it might be a default Java class. I can't quite remember. But you'll have things like those. So let's go over some simple variables real quick. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to create a couple variables. And how you do that is you go to this plus variable, and it will add a new variable. So let's just call this name. And we're going to make it a string. Now you can make it a name, but that'll work just fine. But I'm going to make it a string because this is kind of what I want. Or you can even make it a text. They're all really different applications, but all they do is they just use text and words and data. I think certain ones will use special characters and numbers, other ones will not allow you to do that, so there's the difference between those, I believe. But all I'm going to do is I'm going to use a string, and what I want it to say is in the default value, but it says please compile the blueprint. So what we want to do is compile the blueprint. Now it'll actually let us edit the name. So what do we want our name to be? We want our name to be the Sarge Kyle. So if we compile that and we drag this variable over, you can do something where you control and drag, and that will automatically get. Now if you don't know what getting and setting is, we'll talk about that later, but here's the difference between getting and setting. One, you actually set the variable and what it will be. One, you just get or reference the variable. But alt drag is set, control drag is get. But like I said, we'll talk about set and get later. So what we want to do is we want to connect this return node, or return value, which is what this tiny little dot here is, to this input value. And now the name will no longer be hello YouTube, but it will now be the Sarge Kyle, and we can see that. But let's do another variable type. Let's do a branch. Now what a branch is an if or kind of. Well, it's a yes no. It's an if then or an else then. So what we want to do is get a branch, and what you connect this to is something called a bool or a boolean. So we're just going to drag this here, and as you can see, if you just drag it without doing control or alt, you get the menu of get and set. So what you want to do is get it and connect it to your condition. So what a branch does is it says, okay, our condition is this. If this is true, then we're going to go here. If this is false, then we're going to go here. If it's, well, it has no other option to be true or false, so it has to be one or the other. So if it is true or false, it'll go to those respective places. But how do you set the true or false? Well, what you have to do is you have to click on the variable here, or select it in your variables, your variable menu, and you have to select true or false. So we want this to be true. We want new variable to be true. But you can name it something important, like do I exist? I don't know how to spell exist. I don't know how to spell exist. That's terrible. I can't think of it right now. But do I exist? Well, duh, of course you exist, so we're gonna say true. So we're gonna check that true, and then you can have it do nothing if it's true. You can just let it not do anything. Or you can actually make it do something. So if it's true, then we'll print a string saying, I'm glad you're real. If it's false, then we'll print string and say, where did you go? So that's some examples of some variables, and so let's play our game and let's see what happens. So we of course have to drag our cube back in, so that way all the code is referenced and actually working in the world. So let's play. It says the Sarge Kyle, and it says I'm glad you're real. So now that there's a hole in our cube that's mysterious and leads to nothing on the other side, but it's really just the error from that. Let's go back to this and do some more examples. Let's do a couple more examples of variables. So I'm going to add a variable, and I'm just going to call it number. Now this number, you can have two things be a number. You can have a integer or a float. Now what's the difference, or a byte, that works for a number, but usually you'll want to use integer or float. Now what's the difference between integer or float? They're just this one says floating point number and this one says an integer number. So what's the difference? They're both numbers. Why can't I use them both, or just use them interchangeably? Well, yes, you can use them interchangeably in some circumstances, but I will explain to you what the difference of them are. An integer is a whole number. A float is not a whole number. So here's the difference between an integer. I'm gonna alt drag this integer in. I'm gonna set it as an integer. I'm gonna create another one, and I'm gonna call it number 2. And I'm gonna make it a float. Oops, a float. I'm gonna alt drag that in. So this, here's what you're going to do. Is here you can see it says 0, but this is 0.0. So what I can do is I can do 1.5 or 2.5, fine. But this one I can't do 2.5. Well, I can, but if I compile it, or if I try and click out of it, it'll just go back to 2. It always rounds up. So if I do 2.1, it'll round down to 2. Or no, it doesn't round, sorry. It doesn't round. If I do 2.7, it'll just go back to 2. So decimals don't actually work for it. But decimals, as you can see, do work. Whole numbers also work here. So those are the difference between integers and floats. So if a float was a whole number, then sure, you could set it to an integer. But if an integer was a whole number, but if a float was not a whole number, say it was 2.5, 2.2, and you set it to an integer, it would no longer work. Now, this is the conversion rate for how you convert floats into integers and integers into floats. It works two different ways. So there are conversion rates as long as it's the same type of data value. So say a name, a text, a number, or a true or false. As long as they're both numbers, or they're both texts, or they're both true or false, they'll still work. But if it's a number and a true or false, it won't work. If it's text and a true or false, it may not work. There are certain things that don't work together, but you'll just have to try that out in your code. So those are numbers and how we use those. So that's the basics of blueprints and getting started with blueprints. I really hope this episode helped you with the terminologies and understanding a little bit more about the details panel and the event graph and variables and execution lines and things like that, and return values and return nodes. So I really hope this helped you and you enjoyed this video. If it did help, please leave a like, and a subscription is always appreciated. I put videos up like this at least once a week, and as always, it stays Unreal Engine for the most part. So, thank you so much for watching this episode, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.